Oh my. How came all of you to be here in the sanctuary? They told me upstairs that I'd be arriving on a Saturday. And I hope it's not a memorial service or a funeral. Oh, now I remember. It's Gloucester's 400th celebration, and all of you moderns are rediscovering that story about refusing to pay. It's a great story, and it's a lot better than being here for a funeral, isn't it? You shouldn't look too shocked, though. There is an upstairs, you know. You remember what Jesus said about to his doubting disciples about in my Father's house there are many places? Well, I made the transition in 1815, and I can tell you it's not a bad place at all. Quite nice, actually. And one thing that you should know is that up there, we know more about what's going on down here than you might think. I must say, being back in the sanctuary warms my heart. There is the Willard clock, my dear friend, still needing a regular winding, I'm sure, but with a charming chime on the hour. It's nice to think that ministers come and go, but some things keep ticking through the centuries. And there's my dear wife, Judith. Doesn't she look lovely in her silk dress? That painting was commissioned by her father upon her marriage to John Stevens. It was painted by none other than John Singleton Copley. But alas, John Stevens fell on hard times and died in the West Indies. I am so happy to be here with all of you today, and I hope you will not begrudge an old soul use of a few notes and some spectacles. You know, those of us upstairs tend to lose track of mortal time. Things are different up there. But I did want to refer to a few notes because I know some of you are history buffs, and I would feel very badly if I made any inadvertent factual errors. It is very kind of you to show up to hear about my legal troubles and the way I hope it did some important good for our country. It wasn't my plan to be a VIP, quite the opposite, really. Fortunately, society decided that after I was gone. Did you know that they dug up my coffin from the old granary burying ground near the Boston Common in 1837? So they could place my remains in Mount Auburn Cemetery. After my old bones were reinterred, they erected a grand stone monument, a large fluted column with an urn on top, that they thought more befitting of the first Universalist minister in America. By then, posthumously, of course, I had almost become a saint, a terribly important man, and respectable. But it wasn't like that when I lived in Gloucester, especially in the early days. You probably know that they tried to run me out of town several times, those stubborn Congregationalists. I told them the Almighty loved them as his children, and that the message of the Holy Scriptures was that all were to be saved. But no, they stuck to their old ways, you know, thinking that some people are elect and some people are damned. And they had the poor townspeople paying taxes to support ministers, telling them this miserable news from the pulpit every Sunday. I gave the good news to Gloucester. Yes, I dared to tell the truth, and I nearly paid for it with my life several times. And those stubborn ministers had the temerity to call themselves Christians. How perverse is that? Christ, the only begotten Son of God, sent to save the whole world. And they took his name while going around selling this drivel that some are to be saved and some are not. Hogwash. I got the better of them several times, you know. Even in the pulpit at the First Parish. They dared me once, testing my knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, to give a sermon on a passage found by opening the Holy Book at random. They did this and gave me only the citation, without a clue. But what they didn't know is that my severe but devout father had compelled me to commit the entire Bible to memory under fear of the cane. So I had no difficulty whatsoever in expounding at length upon the obscure text that they chose, something from Deuteronomy, as I recall. I just smiled throughout, and that left them seething. Speaking of smiles, I am glad to see that my old portrait is still hanging on the wall here. A likeness of myself and a rather nice oil painting at that, isn't it? Yes, indeed, they really gave me a fine, kindly gaze. From whatever you look at, that smile seems to follow you with a glint in my eye. I do like that, but I worry that it may be a bit too much like the Mona Lisa. You know, I never sat for a painted portrait. We didn't have money for such extravagance, despite my dear wife Judith's well-to-do family. When the artist painted this portrait 40 years after my departure, word got to me about it upstairs. All the reports from the angels and the archangels said that it was like a window into my soul. I do like that. The artist was no doubt told about the paraphrase of my favorite benediction. You must know the one, don't you? Although they never quite get it right. I was fond of telling my congregation that they might only possess a small light, but they should let it shine as brightly as possible to mirror the light of the Creator. Everywhere they go, just the way silver plate reflects the light of a little candle. And they should give hope, not fear of hell, to the people around them. And especially when they were sad or feeling abandoned, I told them that God's love was everlasting and universal to all of humanity. But you're probably not here to hear a sermon. You want to know about the court case. Well, really, two court cases. My relationship with John Adams, the founders, and to proudly bask in my Revolutionary War role as chaplain to the Rhode Island Regiment under George Washington. I can tell you that was a long, hard slog with many a dark, cold day. But as they say, it's who you know that really counts. When the British blockaded New England's coastline and no one from Gloucester could go out to fish, I was able to get aid from the good general and members of the Continental Congress, those penny-pinching rascals. And that money was sent up to Gloucester. That really got the Congregationalists jealous. But there was nothing they could do about it. People with grateful full stomachs started coming to my modest little First Church meeting house on the Inner Harbor. There's an old saying, you get better results with honey than you get with gall. And I was happy to welcome the grateful townsfolk who came to hear a hopeful message in those deeply troubled times. But what two court cases, you may be asking? You may have missed the subtlety of the story. Most people do. You see, when Ep Sargent's silver pitcher was confiscated in 1782, along with the valuables of my other parishioners, to pay the town taxes for what they called the established church, I really did not want to go to court. But there was simply no choice. On principle, I could not have the goods of my congregation seized to pay for a church whose principal doctrine about salvation they no longer believed in. So we greatly rejoiced in June of 1786 when the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts ruled in our favor concerning our suit to reclaim the seized goods, stating that a free populace could not be compelled to support a state church. That news traveled far and fast and set the key New England precedent for James Madison to write the separation of church and state into the First Amendment in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. Of course, historians typically refer to the Virginia Declaration's guarantee of religious liberty free from state interference as the central precedent, which is very convenient because Madison wrote it. But one has to remember that our new Constitution and the Bill of Rights had to be ratified by the states. So our New England precedent was important. After our first court victory, the Congregationalists proved that they were very crafty. They filed a countersuit saying that because I was not ordained by their established church, that I had been administering the sacraments of baptism, marriage, and funerals illegally. They were seeking hefty fines directly from me, by which they hoped to make me bankrupt, ruin my ministry, and thus hasten my departure from Gloucester. Despite the valiant legal work of my supporters, for a time, it looked as if we were losing. And my entire livelihood, my survival, the survival of my little church, were at stake. So I had little choice. With a heavy heart, I had to leave Gloucester and booked passage in early 1788 on a ship back to England. Fortunately, my correspondent and friend, John Adams, had taken up his position as our country's first ambassador to England in 1785. And there were others there who were very happy to help me. If you want all the details, of course, my dear wife Judith explained what happened as she completed my autobiography after my unfortunate stroke in 1809. She was my angel, my caretaker, and heaven knows she was a superb writer. Not only were her innumerable letters always beautifully crafted, but she was the first woman playwright in our young country, although men accused me of writing the plays because they did not believe that any woman was capable of such. We fell in love through our letters, really. We were kindred spirits and partners. She wrote the first Universalist Catechism, a Sunday school primer to help teach young people about equality, universal salvation, and our belief in a loving God. But as long as I could not be safe in Gloucester and minister to my church, we could not marry. Providentially, while I was in England, a member of the Massachusetts Supreme Court had a change of heart. He came to see the absurd premise of the congregational countersuit. So as my supporters were pressing my case in my absence, it finally appeared that the court would recognize that churches could ordain their own clergy. Hearing of this good news and knowing that John Adams was nearing the end of his term, I elected to join him and his wife Abigail on the same ship home. It was a joyous moment indeed when the formal news of the court ruling came to us aboard ship from another boat that was heading back to England. And it was then that Mr. Adams asked that I preside over church services for the rest of our sail home, which I was more than happy to do. Unfortunately, I don't think his wife was very fond of my less than formal preaching style. In any case, back in Gloucester at Christmas in 1788, my congregation laid hands upon me, and at last I was legally ordained in the Commonwealth. To be sure, my detractors were not happy and made themselves known in Gloucester, but my ministry and income were finally assured. And shortly afterwards, Judith and I were wed and began our new life together. The legislature of our dear Commonwealth, like most legislative bodies, was somewhat slow to respond, but I am glad to note that in 1792, Massachusetts recognized the importance of the second ruling taken with the first. After decades of enduring prejudice and struggle, denominations like Methodists, Anglicans, Baptists, even Catholics could finally incorporate as legal churches without seeking special permission. And the same was true for our Jewish brothers and sisters, whose synagogues could now be legally incorporated. It was a proud day when my congregation, which we called the Independent Christian Church, was incorporated in that year. You may also be wondering, were my travails in Gloucester finally put to rest? Alas, no. I was faced with ongoing controversy over my so-called radical teachings. But I maintain that the scriptures cannot lie, and that if God is love, as the Apostle John states very clearly, our Heavenly Father, like any good father, may discipline us for our misdeeds, but through the sacrifice of his Son, he surely intended that all of humanity should come to salvation. For this radical teaching, I continued to be vilified and threatened in my person. But many people of Gloucester were ready for the good news and joined my congregation. In truth, I could see that it was now time to seek another city for a while, and I turned my attention to Boston, where in 1793 I was called to the First Universalist Society there and served as its pastor for many years. Judith and I enjoyed the intellectual stimulation provided by the capital city of our Commonwealth. We had a comfortable apartment there in a beautiful crescent-shaped building, which reminded us of similar elegant buildings in London, but alas, was torn down long ago. But I suspect you modern residents might agree. Gloucester is a special place that stays in your heart. Despite losing our first child, a son, while living in the manse that Judith's father had built for her upon marrying John Stevens long ago, we were blessed with a daughter, Julia. Helping to establish the Boston church did not diminish our love for the Gloucester congregation and the hope that this church would grow. It was therefore with great pride for us when this fine meeting house was erected and the first service was held in the fall of 1806. The Reverend Thomas Jones, a good man who spoke against the evils of slavery and who was much beloved by the Gloucester congregation, had replaced me when we took up our new task in Boston. They soon outgrew my old meeting house on the harbor and commissioned the master builder, Jacob Smith, to build them a magnificent church, a building that could seat almost 600 people. Larger, I may add, than any of the congregational parishes in Gloucester. Father Jones' task was not an easy one. On the one hand, one of our original signers of our charter was Gloucester Dalton, a former slave of African descent and a healer, and greatly respected in the town. On the other hand, he had some of the wealthiest ship owners who helped pay to erect this fine building. But I suspect that he knew full well that they were clandestinely trading in human beings. Of course, no one would acknowledge that the same ships carrying cod or salt or rum were also running between Africa and Charleston. Some of those ship owners' names are on the stained glass windows of this church, even though they were not added until 1918. So you may be wondering, after all this, how often do the powers that be upstairs let departed souls like me come back and visit here on earth? or even have a window into what all of you are up to. That, dear friends, I cannot divulge. But I will gently remind you of that Christmas poem, since it's nearly that time of year, about my dear friend and relatively recent colleague, St. Nicholas. You better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Santa Claus is coming to town. He is making a list. He's checking it twice. He's going to find out who's naughty or nice. He sees when you are sleeping, and he knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been good or bad, so be good, for goodness sake. I know how easy it is for you moderns to forget or think that this is impossible, childish thinking. But now that you have the internet and discovering artificial intelligence, think again, my dear friends. It is not so far-fetched. There is nothing that escapes the eye of divine providence. So you never know who might be watching, do you? I do love coming back to this old sanctuary, however. It has changed a bit over time, like when they raised the whole building 12 feet and suspended the gallery in 1868. They did that for the centennial, held for this first service I held in 1774 in the home of Judah's father. Did you know that 5,000 people came to Gloucester for that event and lived in a tent city in Stagefort Park? That was truly amazing. Although I was not permitted to make a return appearance. It would have been too scary for them. The powers upstairs do let me visit from time to time, however, in secret, as a kindness. So if you look at my portrait and sometimes have the sense that I'm smiling at you or that my gaze is following you around the room, it may well be so. As the scriptures say, you can only now see as through a glass darkly. But fear not, all will be well in the end. Let your inner light shine, and for heaven's sake, don't give people hell. Give them hope. You will be glad you did, I promise.